Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melbourne Writers Festival Digital. Slightly different circumstances to the ones in which the festival and all of us, I guess, usually find ourselves. My name is Ronnie Scott. I'm a writer. My novel is called The Adversary, and I teach creative writing at RMIT in the Writing and Publishing program. And I am completely delighted to be here to talk to Victoria Hannan about her incredible novel, Kokomo, which I'll introduce shortly. But first of all, I am speaking to you from Wurundjeri country, also known as Collingwood, and Vic is speaking to us from Brunswick East, which is also Wurundjeri country. And so we pay respect to their elders and to the elders of all communities and cultures across Victoria, and I guess across wherever it is that you're watching this really special session from. So Kokomo is Victoria Hannan's first novel. It was the 2019 winner of the Victorian Premier's Literary Awards unpublished manuscript category. And I guess after I've kind of gotten through my intro, I was going to ask Vic if you would tell us what it is that you tell other people when they ask you what your book is about, because all writers get asked that. And it's sometimes a great question and sometimes a distressing and disturbing one. But it's always interesting to see what writers highlight. But first of all, I'll just say what the judges said in their citations about Kokomo, because it certainly made me very excited to read the book. And the book really lived up to it. So they talked about the prose that crackles. They spoke of the deep empathy in the book, the keen eye that you bring to your topic. They said that it's genuinely funny and heartbreaking, and they said that it's disarmingly profound as well. And it is all of those things. So congratulations. Vic's writing has also appeared in McSweeney's Internet Tendency, subbed in, and in her tiny letter about swimming pools. So please, wherever you're watching this from, please help me welcome Victoria Hannan and Kokomo.
Thank you.
Applause. Signal applause. So Vic, what is Kokomo about? What do you tell people?
So I think pretty early on, I worked out a bit of an elevator pitch because I knew that people were going to ask me, even when I kind of said to my friends, I'm going to write a novel, they would ask, obviously, what's it about? And so the thing that the 2-sentence or so kind of thing that I worked out is that it's about a young woman named Mina who's living in London. She's working in advertising and falling in love with some pretty terrible men. And then one day she gets a phone call from her best friend back in Melbourne telling her that her mum has just left the house for the first time in 12 years and she needs to rush home to find out why. So that's the short version. And then the even shorter version, which I sometimes tell people, is that it's just a book with a lot of dicks in it. And then, I mean, sometimes I go into the themes, but I just feel like it's easier to let people choose one of those paths and see if they want to go down either of them themselves.
Right, and we kind of go down all of them in the book. Ooh. I mean, the one of the things that I really love about it is that you know from the very first page that it's going to be a book that is kind of intimate and observational, and also a book that is going to be about bodies and sex. Was that something that you knew you were going to do from the outset, or was that a decision that you kind of came to when you were editing and structuring it?
I think in the past I've written a lot of short stories that have just been about bodies and about sex and love and feelings and all of how all those things tangle in together. And so they've always been like a little bit gross or a little bit creepy, which is maybe says a little bit too much about me as a person. But I think in the past I'd also tried to write novels that were quite serious, sort of literary novels, which were about very solemn things. And it didn't feel true to who I am, and it didn't feel true to my voice. And anyone who's kind of met me or any of my friends can read this and just see it's me on every single page. And so all I wanted to do was just like put that into words, I suppose. And so that's how Kokomo kind of ended up like this. And I was worried that some of those things in the editing process were going to be taken out, but they never were. So I feel really lucky.
Yeah, right. And you also said that you, I mean, obviously you drafted it really extensively. It's really kind of complicated but smoothly put together. And you also told me that you wrote it at different kind of writers' residencies over time, and obviously kind of developed it in all these different ways. But maybe I could ask you about that later if that's okay. You wanted
Yeah.
to read a bit from the start of the book to introduce us to it, right?
Yeah, I feel like this will give people a pretty good introduction about what we're talking about. So this is the very first chapter of the book, and I apologize for all the penises in advance. Mina knew in that moment what love is. She saw it in vivid colour, saw that love is being inside each other, love is being turned inside out together, all that pink, splayed and splayed, everything on show for one another. She knew that love is letting someone inside you or being let inside someone, inside and outside, in love and out of love. She looked at Jack, at his penis so tall and pink, a soldier standing to attention, a ballerina in first position. It was tipping its hat to her, inviting her to dance. Mina saw herself as a sailor, lost at sea, and Jack's penis as a lighthouse, alerting her to the presence of land, to the presence of safety. I am a hiker who has lost her way, Mina thought, and this penis is a cooey heard deep in the bush. Mina felt ready to call back, to respond to love. The second thing Mina knew that she was sure of was that this was the nicest penis she had ever seen, both on the internet and in person. She watched Jack as he began to touch it, his fingers wrapped around the base of it, how you might hold a rolling pin or a truncheon if you're about to brandish it as a weapon, thwack it down hard on a skull. He moved his hand up and down, that calf leather softness pulled taut over all the veins and spongy flesh, all the spouts and tubes. Soon all of it would be inside her, then outside, then inside again, making its way through the entrances and exits of her body one by one, then back again. This was love, she thought, and her heart felt stretched wide open and ready to receive it. Jack looked at her while he touched it. There was a darkness in his eyes she'd never seen before, that she knew now, in this moment, knew for sure to be love. A love so deep it lived in places the sun couldn't reach, down there where the fish have evolved to be too ugly for the light. Loved wiped clean, a blank slate. Love is darkness, she understood this now. Love is shadow, love is shade. Come here, he said, as she shuffled up the grey sofa cushions. Almost on all fours, a kitten padding towards milk. She smiled, wet lips, no teeth. Come here, he grabbed her arm just below the elbow and guided her hand towards him. She could hear her heart beat, a hollow gadunk inside her chest like a drum. She was aware of her body. It felt suddenly that her skin was covered in feathers being ruffled by the wind, that she had the back-combed fur of a dog. The sound, the beating, the thud, it was below her. It was outside of her. It was not her heart, she realized, but her phone vibrating against an empty, forever yellow Tupperware container in her bag. Leave it, Jack said, trying to pull her closer. But her hand reached down, fingers touching the corner of the cool plastic box, feeling the urgent vibrations of it. Leave it, he said, again, the darkness of love in his voice too. She found it, she pulled it out, she looked at the screen, she answered it. Mina, it's your mum, Kira said. She left the house. Then Kira said it again, as if she didn't believe it either. She left the house.
Excellent. Such a good opening. And I think what do I love most about it? I think that it's this kind of spiral of associations and descriptions that all kind of center around this thing that she's looking at and thinking about, and then it gets interrupted by this plot. And then she goes back to Australia from London, and we get this plot that you introduced before. Her mother has left the house, which is significant for lots of reasons. Her mother has not left the house in years and years and years. Mina and her mother both had an experience of grief, and they both reacted to that in different ways, right?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like grief affects so many people in different ways. And for Elaine, the mother, she just kind of shut down a little bit, and she just essentially, for the first few days after her husband passed away, I didn't say that the dad had died. So isn't a huge plot twist, but so Elaine's husband and Mina's father passes away. And then, Elaine just shuts down, and she according to Mina, it's the grief that she can't deal with, and it's the grief that kind of is keeping her trapped in the house. And we find out throughout the book as the plot unfolds that it's actually something quite different, and I'm not going to give anything else away. And so I guess in a reaction to Elaine staying in the house, Mina just realizes that she just can't stay there any longer and she has to get away. And so I think one big theme of the book is this kind of juxtaposition between staying and leaving, which I guess all comes together when kind of Mina comes home. So she comes back and she kind of leaves her life in London to come back and kind of understand why her mother has left the house.
Yeah, it's this really kind of beautiful and complicated way to open the book as well, because it's not just that this kind of sex scene, which you wrote so beautifully, is interrupted by the plot. It's an introduction to the way that the book layers ideas about leaving and staying and memory and the way that your life can be in multiple places at once. And I think that my favorite description of the penis from that first few pages is it kind of comes maybe 7 or 8 pages later when she's back in Australia, but she describes the Georgia O'Keeffe-ish colors of it.
So it's, yeah.
The pink of it. It really is a book that where, yes, we're with Mina the whole time, but Mina is always kind of thinking about where she's come from and trying to work out the puzzle of other people. And it's such a visual kind of photographer's book as well, because it's so it's kind of silly to say a book is descriptive, but it's visual and interpretive. And I love that the way that we're with Mina for so much of it, and the way that yes, the puzzle of other people kind of becomes the same thing that guides us through the book, is the puzzle of the plot and the secrets of the past. When you were building this character of Mina, so you said before that that anyone who knows you would see yourself on every single page of the book. Yeah. Do you see Mina as like a conduit of yourself, or did you mean like a sensibility?
A bit of both, I think, because like Mina, I lived overseas for a long time. So I was in the UK for almost 9.5 years. I worked in advertising. I have seen some penises in my life, both on the internet and in person. And I also, I suppose in the kind of the staying and the going in my personal life, when I was in London, my father was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And I think like anybody who kind of lives overseas or chooses to live overseas or a long way from home and actually has that freedom of movement, you do kind of have that niggling thought in the back of your mind about like, what's the phone call that you're going to get, or what's the kind of emergency that's going to get you on a plane home. And so for me, it was my dad being diagnosed with Parkinson's while I was there, and eventually realizing that I kind of needed to come home to spend some good time with him while he could still walk and talk. And kind of when I got here, I spent a lot of time kind of questioning like where my home was, and kind of, I guess, reacquainting myself with my family, because we've lived apart for such a long time. And then there was kind of also that grief of the life that I left behind there, and kind of mourning that. And so there's a definite like emotional resonance between Mina and I, and also some shared experiences, and some real life experiences of mine are also in the book, but I don't necessarily want to say which ones in case my mum is listening to this. But yeah, so I think there is very much kind of some of my life experiences that have kind of been fictionalized and exaggerated, and maybe a few personality traits which I've taken and kind of made more annoying or kind of more extreme. But then also, I guess, a sensibility too. So there's I mean, even just like the Georgia O'Keeffe reference, like my friends know how much I love art and how big an influence that is on my work. In fact, there's a Georgia O'Keeffe postcard on the wall behind me. And yeah, so I think it's a combination of the two. It's like my life experiences and my view of the world combined.
That's really interesting, and I wonder as well about the atmosphere and the mood of the book, because you said before that kind of when Mina is in Australia, thinking about London, you described that as a kind of grief, as a and it's certainly a kind of absence as well. Did you think about the atmosphere that you were leaving the character with as you were kind of guiding them through this experience of Mina being back home, kind of revisiting all of her old relationships, and also solving this mystery of Elaine, her mother, and why she has left the house?
I feel like the atmosphere was kind of quite true to my experience too, of just like missing my life in London and wondering how that could have been had I not come home. Um, and so I wanted to inject that into her. That was kind of a very deliberate thing, that sort of frustration and that those feelings of grief and that kind of haziness, I guess, of nostalgia for a place. And I don't know that Mina's life in London was a particularly great one anyway. She was doing fairly well in her job, but I think she was putting a lot of things on hold to do well at her job. And so her personal life and, just I guess her creative aspirations as well were things that she put on hold to be successful in this job. And I think coming home, she was forced to confront a lot of those. And so I think all of those things combined kind of creates this weird sort of nostalgic whirlpool which is all mixed in. It's like one of those soft serves of like chocolate and vanilla. It's like grief and nostalgia and everything mixed into one.
And rediscovery, right? Because she's
Yeah.
back in a place that she hasn't been in for a long time.
Yeah, so it feels
Um,
like to her a lot like kind of everything's changed, but also nothing has changed. So kind of some of her friendships are exactly the same, but then others have kind of moved on quite a lot. And obviously the significant thing with her mother has changed and she doesn't know why or how. So it's all very confusing.
right. And I guess that's kind of expressed differently through different characters, because she has her friends like Kira and Shelley, and people from her past like Ben, and people who have links to her family as well, like Brendan. And I wonder if the way that these characters were sort of arrayed around her, like it's interesting. It's interesting as a reader because you're getting a sense of who she expects them to be, but at the same time, like they're kind of people who are surprising her as well because they've changed in ways that she doesn't expect. And I wonder how it is that you drew those characters so beautifully.
I think I've had those experiences in my life too. It's like when you go away for a long time, you can have these really strong friendships that you sort of stay in contact with people. You send the odd WhatsApp message or you like a picture on Instagram, but that actually doesn't make a friendship. And so I definitely had some experiences when I came home where my life was on a completely different track from someone who I thought was a really close friend. And then when you put those people together, it's just like you feel a bit like an alien or something because you've been living this completely different life to them and they have you as well. And so a lot of that was drawn from like a few personal experiences. And I guess that thing that happens in your 30s when people suddenly, like the last people you'll expect will kind of suddenly have children and then you'll just never see them again. And then when you do see them, all you'll talk about is their children. And they pretend to care about your life, but maybe they don't actually because they've found this other thing that is more important to them. And so I think all of those things kind of come into play. And it's just, again, that feeling of just like being a bit of an alien in your own home, I suppose.
It's interesting because it's like it's got a different setup to a coming of age story or a self discovery story. It's more like a accounting for yourself story. It's like, well, here's how my life has turned out.
Yeah, that
Um,
feeling of just like, here is where I thought I would be, and here is where I am, and everybody else is over there. And it's just like that, I think, was especially confronting to her when she came home, because I think she thought that all of the people around her still shared the same kind of dreams and aspirations as her, but they definitely don't.
um, Elaine, Elaine
Mm.
being kind of the other half of the story. Well, I guess Mina is kind of the main kind of person who's driving the story, and we come back to Mina towards the end of the book. But Elaine is kind of the thing at the in the middle of the story that is kind of the mystery and the puzzle and the thing that Mina is really focused on. She's the reason that she's come home. Who is Elaine, and why is she such a mystery to Mina?
Elaine, I think, is even a mystery to herself a little bit. She grew up on a farm. She went to like a Catholic boarding school. She had a pretty bad kind of role models as parents who just really didn't love each other at all. And so I think she spent a lot of her kind of formative years just trying to work out where she fit in this tiny little world that she lived in. And kind of as the story in her life progresses, she starts to kind of realize that the world is bigger and bigger and bigger. And even though she only sort of travels as far as kind of Melbourne outside of the farm, she just has kind of realized that there is more potentially than she's ever been taught. And so I'm going to try hard to talk about this without giving anything away, but she gets married pretty young, and I think she thinks that she's in love in the same way that Mina's kind of trying to understand love and work out love and what it means to her. Elaine thinks that she finds it with Bill, her husband. But then something happens a few years into her marriage, which kind of throws everything upside down and in the air and changes her life and the trajectory of her family's life forever. And I think when you find out that about her, I think it's quite surprising, because I think Mina's idea of her is that she's this closed off, cold, or at least has grown into this closed off, kind of cold, scared, grieving widow who's just is too frightened and anxious to leave the house. But actually she's kind of got this whole inner life going on. And I think one thing that I've always been fascinated about is kind of the point at which you realize that your parents had these lives before they had you. It's like my mother was a woman before me, before she had my sister and I, and she had all of these kind of desires. And I think she actually, every so often during my childhood and kind of later years, would drop these little hints of these little stories about things that had happened to her, and like this Arabian prince that she had allegedly dated, who like parked his Ferrari in a roundabout one time. And it's like, well, hang on, you met Dad when you were 14. So just trying to like put the pieces together of her life and realizing that there's obviously so much more to our parents than we see. And so I've always been really interested in that idea, thanks to my mum's little stories. And I just kind of wanted to introduce that into a character.
Right. I guess it's like the perfect kind of mystery, because it's one that is completely in plain sight, because a parent is someone that in many cases anyway, you kind of grow up with them, and yet there are all of these barriers between the person that they were before you were in their life and the person that they are now, and all these kind of barriers to communication as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the book has a structure. I don't know if it's okay to give away the structure. Maybe I'll let you say what you want to say about the structure, and then I can ask the question.
There has been a few reviews which have like revealed it already. And if anyone happens to look at my Goodreads page, pretty much every single person that's written anything about it gives away what the shift in the structure is. So I think we can talk about the fact that about 2/3 of the way through the book, we shift perspective into Elaine. And a lot of people don't see it coming, but now you will, and I'm sorry about that. But yeah, it was funny when I wrote the first draft of the novel, it was all Mina's perspective, and it just felt, I got to the end of it and I knew like I was getting annoyed by Mina. I was like, there was too much of her voice in it. And I was like, something's missing here and I don't know what it is. But I ended up writing a second draft with the intention that, again, that was going to be all from Mina's perspective, and I was somehow going to make her just, I don't know, give the reader a break from her somehow. And I kind of got about 2/3 of the way through the second draft, and it just dawned on me one day where I was like, oh shit, the thing that is missing is Elaine's story. And it kind of bummed me out a bit, actually, because I was like, oh, but I'm so close. I thought I was so close to the end. And yet here is this whole other story that I have to write. And so I kind of let myself sulk for an afternoon. And then the next day I just like got back to work.
And did you have to make kind of formal decisions around what Elaine's voice was going to be, or was it a process of kind of trial and error in the same way as I'm sure Mina's was as well?
For some reason, as soon as I made the decision that I was going to write it, and I sat down to write it, it just came out so easily and naturally. And like, it's almost like she was like kind of building herself or festering away in the background for all that time. And then she just came out almost not fully formed on the page, because I did a lot of work on her sections in my structural edit. But kind of the voice and kind of who she is, and that kind of, I guess, the looseness that we see from her pretty early on compared to what Mina thinks of her, which is like this kind of closed off woman, that just seemed to really flow pretty easily.
Right, which I guess must have been a satisfying feeling to have, and validation that it was the right choice to write the Elaine section.
Definitely. I think if I had struggled with her after that like bad day where I sulked for a bit, people call it a eureka moment. For me, it was more like a sinkhole where I was like, oh God, being sucked down into the earth. If I had found her really difficult to write following that, I don't even know if this novel would have existed. But the fact that she came out so easily kind of definitely made me realize I was doing the right thing.
You said before that you kind of had an idea of what you would say to your friends when you said that you were going to write a novel, kind of before you had started writing it. What was it that drove you to write Kokomo, and how different is the finished product from what you thought it would be?
So I've written 3 novels before this one. I think mostly because I wanted to teach myself how to write a novel. The first one I wrote in like 2003 or something. It was my first ever advertising job, and I was writing ads for housing estates. And it was like pretty depressing and pretty boring. And so I just thought one day, I knew that NaNoWriMo, which is the National Novel Writing Month or something, was coming up, which is where you're supposed to write 50,000 words in a month. And I was like, I could probably do that. So I just sat at my boring job and just like wrote a novel in a month. And I was like, okay, well, that's achievable. It's like, and it was very bad. And I think I've deleted all known copies of it now. So hopefully no one will ever see it. But it was just an exercise in kind of proving to myself that I could sustain a narrative for kind of a novel-ish length. And then a couple of years later, I sort of knew someone that had a novel published. And I was like, well, if she can do it, I can probably do it. And so I tried again, and I wrote another like very, very, very bad novel. It was very bad. Again, I would be humiliated if anybody ever saw it. But again, it was just like, I kind of just got the real itch for it then, a real taste for it. And then I wrote another one after that, which was just, it's kind of strange dystopian sci-fi, not sci-fi, it was like a dystopian feminist climate change novel, which is not the worst thing ever, but I don't know, maybe I'll send it to my publisher one day if I'm struggling with the next one. But it was kind of when I got the idea for Kokomo that and it was really just kind of a very top line idea. It was just, I knew it was going to be about someone coming home. I knew it was going to be called Kokomo because I think it's funny. And I really actually hate that Beach Boys song, which makes it even funnier to me. And I think once I kind of had that idea, and the more I thought about it, it just didn't really let go. And I was working in a job at the time that was just incredibly stressful. My hair was falling out. I was kind of working 60 hours a week. And I had this weird rash that like looked like ringworm because I was so stressed, but it wasn't ringworm. It was just pure stress rash. And so I just decided that I needed to kind of change my life a bit. And so I thought that maybe I would apply for some writing residencies in like very far away countries. And then if I got into one, then I was going to quit my job and go and write the novel. And I did. And so I quit my job and flew to South America on my own and wrote the first draft.
Excellent. And what was it that made this the draft that you then kind of, went back to and did in a few different places and turned into the book that it is, rather than kind of, the first three that I guess I've heard them called apprentice novels before, the ones that don't end up being your first novel. Like what was it about this that made you really want to finish it?
I think it was the first time, even though that first draft was like very different to this one. So the first draft was actually going to be set in Kokomo, Indiana, not in Australia.
High concept.
Yeah, it was too obvious. But also I thought that was like pretty funny to set it there. It's like a pretty strange industrial town with like a low unemployment and high crime rate. But obviously I've never been to Kokomo, Indiana. And so I did a lot of research on Google Maps and Google Street View, trying to actually understand what it looked like and what it was like to be there. I followed the mayor on Facebook, all that kind of like hard-hitting research I was doing. But afterwards, it's like I knew that the kind of basis of the story was good, and I knew that the character of Mina was interesting and her friendships were interesting. And the idea of kind of her world and her family's world being this quite small neighborhood, I knew that was good, and the heart was there, and there were some good jokes that I liked. And so it was like, well, I've kind of come this far, I might as well keep going.
Did the jokes that you like stayed in it, or did they kind of have to fall by the wayside as the plot?
I think some of the good ones are still there. I'm pretty happy that first chapter didn't really get changed at all, which was one of the things that I was worried the most about.
Why were you worried about it?
Because I really like it, and I kind of got told by a few people, kind of even before I started meeting with publishers, I was like, oh, well, that first chapter's got to go. By a few people that had read it, it's like, well, that first chapter, I can see why you did it to get the attention of the judges. I was like, well, that's not something that ever even crossed my mind. I like wrote it in the notes app on my phone, standing on a train platform on my way to work one day. And I just thought it was really funny, and it continued to make me laugh, which is why it stayed there. But I think it's going to be divisive to people. Like a few people are going to be a bit confused by it, and that's kind of part of the fun too, I think.
Right, that makes sense. So it's like a declaration of your aesthetic and your sense of humor, and also kind of a buy-in for the reader?
I think so. And it's like, if you think the first chapter is funny, then you're going to like the book. But then I guess a few people have kind of read it and were like, oh, I'm not sure about that, but I loved the rest of it. So I don't know. I think it could go either way.
Right. I guess that's interesting as well, right? To have people have a mixed response to something that you've done.
Yeah, I sort of love the idea also of like someone just like picking it up in a shop and like starting to read the first page and then being like, I absolutely am not going to buy that, or I am absolutely going to buy that. I kind of wish that I could just stand in some bookshops and watch that happen.
I really like, I mean, we kind of gave away the whole structural conceit of the book, but we don't have to give away the way in which Kokomo, the song, actually appears in the book now. But I'll just say that I really enjoyed that. I thought that was a great scene.
Oh, thank you. That was really fun to write. There were a couple of scenes in there which were I just had the best time writing them, like the party scene where they're all kind of dressed in fancy dress. That one was very fun.
Why was that fun to write?
I guess just like coming up with silly costumes for people, mostly. It's like, what's the most ridiculous things that I can think of? And actually, I did once go to a fancy dress party dressed as Steve-O, like dead Steve-O. And then my housemate at the time, she went dressed as the Stingray. A lot of people had a lot of trouble guessing who we were trying to be, but it made me laugh a lot. So yeah, it was absolutely worth it. And actually the unicorns, the kind of the character, or the costumes that three of the characters go dressed in, that was a true experience that some friends of mine had at I don't want to give too much away, but had at a fancy dress party too. So Yeah,
Fantastic.
it's just, I don't know, in all the kind of grief and some of the dark moments, it was nice to kind of have a fun time every so often.
Right, right. And again, I think it's that mix that readers seem to really respond to is the kind of the fun and the darkness of the book. So I think that's done so well. And the unicorns were memorable as well. So thank you, thank you. Um, sometimes people ask writers why it is that they wrote a novel, and I think the secret answer is that they could only write a novel, but you're a photographer as well. So what, I mean, I know that they're such different forms in so many ways, but why prose and why fiction instead of images and visuals?
Such a good question. And I feel like I grapple with this a lot in my life too. And I think especially when I was in the UK, my photography career, for want of a better word, was doing so much better than my writing. It's like I was writing some pretty bad short stories then, and like that dystopian feminist novel that I talked about. And it was kind of quite easy to kind of lean into the photography side of things because I was getting some great jobs, and like I had a blog that was like weirdly successful for a time when people used to have blogs way back when. But I felt kind of like I had this muscle in my brain that wasn't being used. It's like, have you ever seen a photo of Ted Danson with his shirt off? This will make sense in a
I don't
second.
know.
So he has this.
No, I don't think I have.
Yeah, well, maybe you should look that up later in your own time. He has this condition called Poland syndrome, which is where like the muscles on one side of your body are like underdeveloped, and so you see pictures of him, and it's like he's got this like one buff pec and this other one like completely flat one. So that's kind of that. I felt like Ted Danson with my shirt off when I was like just concentrating on photography. And also like the photography that I do is kind of a vernacular style. And so I shoot on film and it's all natural light. And so it's very much like the world exactly how I see it with zero, like I don't really edit photos at all. And so there's just kind of no manipulation there whatsoever. It's like very true to the world, I suppose. But with writing and with fiction, you can obviously bend things to kind of your viewpoint a little bit more, and you can have a bit more freedom and a bit more power over kind of what you're saying and showing. I do
And I
actually
guess
think
even
that, I was going to say, hopefully one day in the future, I will have a book that has both in it. That's kind of something that is percolating in the back of my head.
cool, like a dystopian feminist photography image. Everything.
Yeah, just taking pictures of the world as it is now.
That's really very depressing.
Yeah.
Did you want to read some of the Elaine section as well to let us know kind of what that feels like?
I would love to. The green striped wallpaper, the blood red wood, it made Elaine feel glamorous. She sat at the bar atop a high leather stool, her legs too short to reach the floor, the low heels of her shoes clanking against the metal bar as she swung her feet nervously. If he comes, it means something, she thought. It means love, or at least the promise of it. Please come, she begged silently. Please come, please come, please come. She stared at the row of taps and read the names of beers she'd never heard of, some she'd seen ads for. The tall, bald bartender pulled a pint for a man standing at the end of the bar. It looked black, thick like gutter water, with an off-milk froth. Behind the bar were rows of spirits in bottles. She recognised two of them, the brandy her mum drank a small glass of every Saturday night, two on Christmas Day, the whiskey her dad brought out at the end of the dinner when she and Bill had announced their engagement, a glass for him and a glass for Bill. The barman approached her. Elaine noticed that his eyes were the same green as the wallpaper, the same green as the carpet. She wondered if they were always that colour, or if they'd changed gradually since he started working there. She didn't know if this was even a thing the body could do. She was only just learning the magic her body was capable of. At this point, it felt like anything was possible. "What'll it be, love?" he asked, an English accent buried deep in there somewhere. She felt her face flush. "A small glass of Carlton Draft," she said, so tentatively it was almost a whisper. It was the beer on the billboard she'd seen from the tram. She knew the suburb. She and Bill had eaten in an Italian restaurant there once. A pot of Carlton it is. The bartender pulled a glass from under the bar, cocked it on an angle, and poured the beer. She looked around the bar. It was a festival of men in there, men laughing, talking, their voices like far-off traffic. They were familiar men, bankers, insurance men, all too much like Bill. She knew she'd picked the wrong kind of place. It's close to your work, she'd told him. Just come for 10 minutes. Just come, she begged him. Please come, please come. In the 24 hours between her asking and her dangling her feet nervously from the high stool, Elaine had rewritten her whole future, a frenzied imagining of a new life. She saw beauty previously where there'd been little. The way the sun shone through the blinds in the morning, fractured light fanned in beams, the colours of the rainbow lorikeets that sang and danced in the gums. Everything seemed more magical to her, more colourful, more real, more true, more alive. That'll be $1.50, the barman said, and Elaine found the change in her purse, her hand shaking ever so slightly as she passed it over. She looked at the amber liquid. It fizzed and bubbled, the sweating glass crowned by a small white head. She took a sip and it tasted bitter but not bad. She took another and she liked it more. She waited. Every time the door opened, her heart would split wider and wider, a volcanic fissure, a rift valley. She'd crane her neck, hoping it was him, but each time she saw another man in a suit. Not him, not yet. Soon, though, soon. The longer she waited, the more time she had to inflate what his coming or not coming would mean, her heart growing like rising dough. Please come, please come. Her beer was warm, mostly just froth by the time he slipped through the door. He wore a blue jacket, jeans. He'd not yet changed into his work uniform. Her whole body stiffened at the sight of him, his black hair, big eyes. She didn't think she'd ever seen someone so beautiful, so perfect. And he was there for her. He saw her and walked to her with his head down. He seemed to be shrinking himself so as not to be seen. But she saw him. She couldn't believe he'd come.
Amazing. Thank you. Do you think that Mina and Elaine are like each other? Are they? I mean, obviously they're related, and there's all this distance between them. But I feel kind of such a like you know that they have something to do with each other when you read those two sections.
Definitely. There were certain parts of their personality that I tried quite hard to kind of mirror, even in quite subtle ways. And I think there are parts in Mina's section where she's like spending a lot of time on her phone, kind of trying to work out where Jack is. He's all the way in London, but because of like social media these days, we can kind of know where people are at all times, or know what they're up to, or see what they're liking, or see who they're making friends with on Instagram or whatever. And there's a kind of similarity with Elaine's behavior, where she's like gets a little bit obsessed with this person and she kind of follows them and she watches them. And it's actually just the same behavior, but Elaine's seems quite a bit creepier because she's doing it in person. But Mina's doing it too. She's just doing it in the privacy of her own home and on her phone. And so there were little things like that. And I guess also this kind of reimagining of love and kind of them both trying to work out throughout their lives what it means to them. I think that's very similar, and it's not something that they would ever talk about to each other. But I like the idea of us kind of seeing that and the way that they're behaving and the way that they're working through those things from afar.
Right. That's amazing. So we're asked to sort of to join those dots a little bit and to think about what their similarities are at different points in the book.
Yeah, I wanted to make it a bit subtle, but there was definitely also this idea of desire and how both women are kind of exploring that in their very different ways. And that's partly a generational thing. Like Mina obviously has the opportunity to kind of talk about it more and is more open, and, you know, she can look at porn on the internet, whereas back in Elaine's day when she was younger, everyone was kind of a bit more buttoned up, and if you wanted porn, I guess you had to go to get it in VHS form or something from a mail order in the back of a magazine. I don't know how those things worked back then, but she would never even have thought to do that because she spent so much of her life just like thinking that she couldn't talk about those things or explore those things.
Vic, I think this has to be the last question because we're kind of coming to the end of the session. But where do you think they leave? Or where do you think you leave us with those two characters at the end of the book? If you can say without kind of wrecking it completely, how do they feel about each other, and what are they going to be like going forward?
I don't think they even know that yet. They take some baby steps towards understanding each other. And I think there are points when Mina hits kind of rock bottom and has to come back up and kind of start to see things as they really are. And one of those things is her mother. And so it's a bit of a rude awakening for her, but also I think for Elaine, maybe there's like quite a bit of weight that gets taken off her by being able to share some of the things that have happened to her in the kind of 12 years or even longer than that she's been kind of holding these secrets. So I like to think that maybe they're a little bit lighter towards the end of this. But who knows what can happen? Maybe the pandemic is coming for them too.
Again, a horrible thought, but a wonderful book. And, I think that if the pandemic did come for them, it would still, you would find a way to convey it in a way that is playful and that is kind of beautiful and laden with interesting cultural references and, intimations of the characters' various possible futures and pasts.
And also Elaine, I was going to say Elaine's been in the house for 12 years already, so lockdown would be an absolute breeze for her.
She's prepared. She's absolutely ready for our current
circumstances. Very practiced, for sure.
Thank you so much, Victoria Hannan, for talking to us about Kokomo. There are lots of other wonderful events at MWF Digital that you can check out. And also Kokomo is for sale at the MWF Melbourne Writers Festival website and at their partner bookseller Readings. So thank you so much for joining us.